All righty, we have our speaker, and I think he and I crossed wavelengths on too many Zoom sessions. So thank you for everyone's patience and dealing with our first technical glitch of the quarter. And also thank you for joining us on Zoom. We have every intention and still have the hope of making this a hybrid seminar series, but this week and next week, we are planning to have it exclusively on Zoom. And depending what the university tells us, we would hope for our third seminar in a couple of weeks, we will start in a hybrid format where we will be live at Stanford and also allowing people to participate via Zoom. With that being said, again, welcome to our winter quarter seminar series on wildfires. My name is Derek Fong. I should actually confess to you, I'm actually wearing two hats as part of this series this quarter. First, I'm going to obviously serve as your moderator and convener for this quarter series. And I'm also in the background hoping to encourage and inspire students to participate in the Big Earth Hackathon Wildfire Challenge this spring quarter, where we will be challenging students to come up with innovative solutions to many problems in wildfire, some of which will be talked about during this quarter seminar series. I also should acknowledge that this series has been made possible through the support of the Bill Lane Center for the America West, the Woods Institute for the Environment, Precourt Institute for Energy, and Center for Sustainability Data Science. This seminar series was born out of a desire to engage the broad community at Stanford and beyond about some of the important issues surrounding wildfires and some of the proposed paths forward to mitigating their impact. As most of us can recognize, wildfire has gone from an infrequent and distant news item to a center stage issue spanning many consecutive weeks for both urban and suburban communities. Frequent wildfires are changing everyday lives in California in numerous ways, from public safety power shutoffs to hazardous air quality. That seemed inconceivable just a few years ago. Moreover, elevated wildfire risk in the Western United States and similar climates globally is here to stay into the foreseeable future. It is our hope that this series this quarter will highlight solutions to many problems of interest in wildfire research, as well as how we can move forward to a safer and more sustainable future in the face of climate change and forest management practices from the past century. Our hope is also to ultimately create an ongoing dialogue and series of collaborations which make headway into several critical areas of interest in wildfires. And as I mentioned previously, we also want to encourage participation, both from students as well as industry partners and faculty in this spring's Wildfire Challenge. I am thrilled to have Michael Wara kicking off our series today. Michael is a lawyer and a scholar focused on climate and energy policy and an expert in wildfires. He's a senior research scholar at the Woods Institute for the Environment and director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program, which provides fact-based, bipartisan, technical, and legal assistance to policymakers engaged in the development of novel climate and energy law and regulation. Michael Wara also facilitates the connection of Stanford faculty with cutting-edge policy debates on climate and energy, leveraging Stanford's energy and climate expertise to craft real-world solutions to meet these challenges. His legal and policy scholarship focuses on carbon pricing, energy innovation, and regulated industries. He collaborates often with economists, engineers, and scientists in research on the design and evaluation of technical and regulatory solutions to climate and energy challenges. Prior to becoming part of the Woods Institute, Wara was an associate professor at Stanford's Law School and an associate in Holland & Knight's government practice. He holds a JD from Stanford's Law School, and he has a PhD in ocean sciences from the UC Santa Cruz. I've learned a great deal from Michael over the past few years. His engagement with policymakers, scientists, and stakeholders, as well as his broad understanding of the issues related to wildfires, is unparalleled. I think you're in for a treat today, as Michael talks to us today about wildfire mitigation and protection, which expenses make the most sense. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael. I would encourage you to raise your hands politely if you want to use the Zoom feature. Use the chat feature if you'd like. I'll try to moderate questions there, and hopefully we'll have a little time at the end to engage in a dialogue about what he talks about. Thanks, Mike, for being here. Thank you for this. Sorry for the screw up on Zoom sessions. We're looking forward to your talk today.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Derek. And I'll just share screen real quick. It's the one I want. And I apologize for the mix-up, which I imagine was mine and not yours. Just got a little confused with the blizzard of Zoom invites that I've been getting lately. So I'm going to talk today about wildfire investments in California. And I'll just say that this work really comes out of the close collaboration that I've had with both colleagues at Stanford, some of whom are listening today. Especially acknowledge Mike Mastrandrea, the research director at the Climate and Energy Policy Program, and also with outside stakeholders, working closely with the legislature, with the investor-owned utilities in the aftermath of the utility caused fires in 17, 18, and 19, and more recently, with prescribed fire stakeholders, both the prescribed burn associations in the state of California and tribes that are interested in restoring cultural burning to landscapes in California. And I'm going to give kind of a broad talk here. I hope it's a nice framing for what follows this quarter in the wildfire seminar, and also hopefully sets up some problems for folks in the audience to think about and comment on, and maybe even do some research on. My goal in the work at the Climate Energy Policy Program is really to better connect Stanford researchers to policy. And a lot of that involves listening to the outside world, and then bringing information back to Stanford so that we can do better research, more relevant research that addresses the pressing needs in the state. And I think while I'm going to talk about California today and focus here, this is not just a California problem, obviously. This year's and last year's fires in Oregon really mimicked what played out in California over the last 5 years. We're seeing fire behavior in Colorado that is extraordinary, not just what happened this January in Louisville and Superior, but the fires from last summer that were jumping the Continental Divide like it wasn't there. And we're seeing fires in the western slope of the Cascades in Washington, which are also really extraordinary, at least in the modern era. So this is a West-wide problem, and I would even say it's broader than that when you think about Australia and the Mediterranean climates in Europe that have been really struggling with wildland fire. And so my hope would be that what we learn in California and what we do in California can be useful, not just here, but more broadly, and that the science we're doing at Stanford and the policy work we're doing at Stanford can really be useful as a global model for how to adjust to the changes we're observing in wildland fire. And also, even broader than that, as a new venue in which to take on issues of climate adaptation that are only going to become more pressing as the years go by. So I'm going to talk about 4 things today. What is the wildfire challenge that we face? And I think it's really important to be clear about that and to address what we do towards the challenge we face today, and not the challenge that perhaps we faced in 1940 or 1960 or 1980. What are we spending today? What is the actual expenditure on the wildfire problem within the state of California across all silos? And that's not something you see very often. It's not we tend to hear about, the wildfire budget at the state level, or perhaps wildfire spending at the federal level, or perhaps utility wildfire spending, but we don't often compare them all and hold them up as a package that society is paying for. What are the needs? What do we need to be doing to fully address the wildfire challenge in California? And what science do we need? Where do we need to go if we're gonna as a university and as a research community meet the needs of policymakers in addressing this challenge? And I think you'll see there's a lot of science, there's a lot of policy work, there's a lot of legal scholarship that needs to be done, but I'm going to try to just sketch that out and hopefully seed some ideas for folks that have skill and capacity that are listening in. So traditionally, when we talk about the wildfire challenge, we think about trees burning. This is a picture from the Rimfire in Stanislaus National Forest. There are many, many, many pictures that you could put up or find of forests burning across the West. I use the Rimfire as an example of kind of traditional thinking about wildfire because it burned mostly where people don't live, almost exclusively actually where people don't live. It burned in the Stanislaus National Forest and in Yosemite National Park in 2013 and was kind of one of the first fires to exhibit the modern pattern of extraordinary fire, extraordinarily intense fire behavior. There was a memorable night where there was a 10-mile run on the Rimfire, and the fire just consumed massive quantities of timberlands that had been replanted 20 years before in the late 1980s, early 1990s after a prior fire, with the idea of harvesting the timber on a 50 to 80 year cycle, and it went up like matchsticks in one night. Traditionally, the way we've thought about fire is through that lens, through that timber and forest management lens. You see this most notably in the way that fire statistics are presented by the agencies that are charged with managing fire, and in the public communications. What you hear on the news, what you hear from anyone trying to summarize the problem, and that is in terms of acres burned. And I'm going to argue throughout this discussion that acres burned is the wrong metric, and that we need to really be thinking about our communications around fire, how we think about tools to address the problem, and approaches we might take to manage the problem better using other metrics. And that also is going to entail creating new science, new ways of measurement and rapid analysis of impact to better communicate with the public about what the wildfire challenge is. But acres burned, I'm going to argue, is a poor metric. And but it's a metric, and it's one that gets used in science a lot, and the trends are disturbing, to say the least. This is a prominent paper in the literature looking at impacts of climate change on trends in burned area over the last several decades. And you can see that there does appear to be a trend. In addition to the kind of upward trend in acres burned, there's a trend toward larger fires, fewer larger fires, rather than many small fires. And that appears to be climate driven. The mechanism is through something that is either directly through what's called vapor pressure deficit, which is just how saturated the atmosphere is with water vapor relative to its total capacity, whether to its total capacity to hold water. And as the atmosphere warms, it can hold more water vapor. That makes it, in essence, thirstier. And so the mechanism is that plants on the ground evaporate more into that drier, warmer atmosphere. The fuels are drier, and that leads to an increase in burned area. And there's a growing scientific consensus that this is a phenomenon that's really important in terms of driving the acceleration and increase in fire and fire intensity and fire behavior over the past several decades. And if this is right, the future is quite frightening, because vapor pressure deficit is a nonlinear function of changes in temperature. And so we can expect that, by the next decade or so, what seems extraordinary today as a fire season, or in terms of an individual fire's behavior, will be kind of normal, because the temperature is going to continue to warm. And on average, obviously variability will matter, and that's going to drive increasingly thirsty atmosphere over plants and the land. That's going to dry the fuels out faster and more completely, and that's going to lead to increased fire intensity and fire behavior in areas that, catastrophic fire behavior in areas that really haven't experienced that before. So that's one way to look at fire. But I think the wildfire challenge that California faces, and the reason that we're all worried about it, actually has more to do with communities and people than acres burned. This is a picture of Paradise shortly after the Camp Fire, and just what we all know has become the familiar image of wildfire's destructiveness in California is loss of communities. And California doesn't have homes or communities to spare these days. Everyone who lives in Palo Alto and has to rent or afford a mortgage knows this. And we can ill afford to lose housing. And we're losing substantial numbers of structures due to wildfire over the past several years. As much as 10% of what we're building is being lost to fire. A consequence of that in many places is homelessness. In the aftermath of major fires, the most vulnerable, the low and moderate income renters tend to lose their housing, and many of them end up unsheltered in the communities adjacent to the ones that have been destroyed by fire. And so homelessness in Chico, which is just downhill from Paradise, is extraordinary at this point and really unprecedented. And to a significant degree, this has been driven by the loss of housing that occurred during the wildfires of 2018. And it's had enormous ramifications for politics in the region, and for there's little prospect of sort of catch up in the housing stock, even as Paradise is being rebuilt. So one kind of wildfire challenge is the challenge to our housing stock. We need to build more housing as it is in California to house our population and reduce the number of unsheltered people in the state. And wildfire is pushing against that in a number of ways. It's pushing against it in terms of where we can safely build, and it's pushing against it in terms of the total number of homes that are available. It's also pushing against it in terms of the insurability of the existing housing stock. The other aspect of wildfire that I think deserves much more emphasis, and I would just add that a number of the researchers at Stanford are really leaders on shifting this conversation, most notably Kari Nadeau and the Sean Parker Center, Mary Prunicki as well, Lisa Patel, and also Marshall Burke's group within School of Earth are really focused on the impact of wildfire on air quality and public health. And I actually think this is an incredibly important part of shifting the conversation on fire, because it changes the problem fundamentally in terms of its political salience to most of the people in California. Most of the people in California do not live anywhere near a wildland urban interface. They live in the developed urban parts of California that are near the coast, principally the urbanized parts of the Bay Area, and most importantly, the urbanized parts of the LA region. And the main impact that those people experience from fire is smoke. And so drawing the connection, helping people in urban areas to understand the connection between what they experience, their own health, the health of their children, and of their parents, who are the most vulnerable to smoke impacts, helping them to understand the risks and the potential options that exist for the state as a whole to address this problem, I think is incredibly important to motivating the kind of societal change and investment that are going to be required. And I just note that, some of the most important work that's really going on here at Stanford, involving the Sean Parker Center and Marshall Burke's group, involves pregnant women. And there's very interesting data that's in review that shows how miscarriage rates are affected by smoke events. And separately, Marshall Burke's group, Sean Hefneal and others published really, really important study that's last year that just illustrates the risks, how the risks of premature birth and the consequent negative health outcomes that are associated with that are influenced by smoke exposure. And the bottom line is they are strongly influenced by smoke exposure. And so I would argue that the right way to understand the wildfire challenge is in terms of people's health, children's health, the unborn, and in addition, the health of communities. That we need to preserve California communities. We need to take the steps that are necessary to protect the loss of entire communities, like what occurred in Paradise, like what occurred in Santa Rosa, or in Ventura during and after the Thomas Fire. So how are we doing? What do we spend money on in terms of wildfire in California? We spend money in a variety of ways to reduce the risks and hazards associated with wildfire. Two of the most significant aspects of spending in California relate to utilities. We spend $2 billion a year. I should say, sorry, the axis here isn't labeled, billions of dollars per year. We spend about $2 billion a year on utility tree trimming in California. So it's designed to reduce the chances that a tree will hit an uninsulated wire, cause a short, or knock that wire onto the ground, or knock a utility pole or transformer out and ignite a fire. We also spend more than $5 billion a year on utility grid hardening. This is a variety of activities, oftentimes installation of sort of situational awareness, hardening of poles, hardening of the cross beams from which the wires are suspended, upgrades of the grid to allow more targeted use of public safety power shutoffs, whole variety of activities oriented at grid hardening, and recognize that tree trimming and grid hardening are basically designed to reduce ignitions. I'll talk more about that in a second. We also spend a fair amount of money as a state on, sorry for the typo, hazardous fuels reduction at the state level. Last year, we spent about $1.5 billion. The federal government, and there's no way to really break down what the federal government does in terms of hazardous fuels to the state level, but the federal government spent about $270 million, so a non-trivial amount of money as well. But that was nationwide, spread across all the Western states and Alaska, which is a big place when it comes to U.S. Forest Service lands. California spends a tiny amount of money so far, really a pilot scale amount of money on what's called home hardening. The $25 million last year, that's going to be the governor's budget proposed spending an additional $16 million this year. And then we spend a fair amount of money on fire suppression. State fire suppression costs were $3.5 billion last year. That's Cal Fire. And federal fire suppression costs are, again, hard to estimate because the federal government tends to present its numbers as on a nationwide level rather than state by state. But one estimate is that they were at the state level for California about $2 billion, and that's about half the total fire suppression budget for the federal government last year. So California is kind of a special case and a very expensive one when it comes to fire suppression. So taking all these numbers and sort of framing them in a different way, rather than thinking about them in terms of how the narrow budget terms that they're in, but thinking schematically about it, where's this money going? And I think you could characterize it as sort of three buckets: ignition prevention, harm reduction, and fire suppression. And as a state, we're spending more than $7 billion trying to prevent ignitions, but solely from utility lines. We're spending a little bit less than $2 billion on reducing the harms that might occur when wildfires happen, when ignitions occur. And we're spending something like $5.5 billion on fire suppression. A basic theme of what I'm going to say for the remainder of this talk is that this is fundamentally out of whack, that we need to be spending much more on that middle column, harm reduction, rather than on ignition prevention or fire suppression. So why are we focused in the way that we're focused, though? I think that there are three basic reasons. One is public perception and understanding. Another is the liability regime that governs fire. And a third is historic funding patterns and institutional biases that exist within the agencies that govern our relationship with fire. So public perception and understanding. People are taught from a very early age that the key to preventing fire is avoiding ignitions. This is a very early example of U.S. Forest Service communications on fire, but the basic idea, continues right up to the present with Smokey the Bear. I sort of prefer Bambi just because I like Bambi, but please, mister, don't be careless. What that means is don't be careless in terms of putting out your campfire, or perhaps dropping a cigarette out your car window as you're driving along. I guess people don't smoke that much these days anymore, but that used to be more of an issue. Don't be, not one more spark is the goal, right? And the idea is that if only we can prevent ignitions, then we can avoid wildfire. Unfortunately, the science around this isn't really supportive of that idea, and I think this is a point I really want to touch on. This is from a paper, kind of important paper by a guy named Safford et al. It's focused on federal lands in California. That's why only part of California is mapped in this figure in the color. PFRID is percent fire return interval departure. So what does that mean? That means that the ecosystems in California have a particular natural fire return interval. That means they're meant to burn on a certain interval. Forests in California evolved with fire. Before people were here, there were lightning-caused fires. Once people arrived, supplementing lightning-caused fires were fires that were ignited very frequently as a part of cultural practices by Native Americans living throughout the state of California. And so one question we might ask is, to some degree, are the fires we're getting because of a fire drought in many parts of California? And there are people I've spoken with who, fire ecologists, forest ecologists in general, think about fire as something that is as natural as rain in most California ecosystems. So this map shows the degree to which we're missing fire on a percentage basis. And blues on this map show where there is a fire deficit, and yellows and reds show where there is too much fire, where the fire return interval is actually shorter than the fire return interval that was present prior to European settlement of California. And this isn't a full map. It doesn't include places like Lake County, Marin County, Sonoma, Napa, but what you can see, broadly speaking, is that there's a significant fire deficit. There's lots of blue on this map, where in the Sierra and in the Coast Range, and there's perhaps more fire, in some places significantly more, in the chaparral dominated mountains of Southern California. And that's a typical pattern that we see. One thing I'd note about this is that it's harder to know what the fire return interval is or was in chaparral prior to European settlement, because you don't have as many tree rings to use as indexes for fire return interval, right? You can't core a tree and sample and see burn scars on the tree. California has a fire deficit. Part of the problem with the idea of avoiding ignitions is that it defers the need of California ecosystems to burn, and tends to push them into states where, when they are ignited, they are much more likely to burn catastrophically and at high intensity rather than at low to moderate intensity. but I think the public perception that, you know, we can or should prevent every spark is also changing. It's pretty clear to people that live in California at this point that we cannot prevent every spark, or that we are not, if there is some possibility of doing it, we're not successfully doing it, right? And it's pretty much clear to everyone who lives here that the fire problem is getting worse, and that the mechanisms we have, the tools we have historically used, are not working as effectively as they perhaps did in the 1980s, 1990s, pick your decade, in the 20th century. So public perception and understanding of fire is changing, and I think that's a really good thing. But one key aspect of that change is that we need to work on as a scientific community is better communication around the need for fire in ecosystems, and how different kinds of fire are produced or avoided. A second piece of the spending puzzle is the liability regime we have for fire. Two questions to think about. When is lighting a fire a crime or negligence, or when might it constitute negligence in the eyes of a court? That's important to think about if we want to have some return to a natural fire return interval in California. Because if it's illegal to set fire, then no one will. And if setting a fire might constitute, or allowing a fire to burn might constitute negligence, right, and create civil liability, then especially in a context where the value of land and the value in particular real estate is very high, right? California is the most expensive real estate market in the United States, maybe close to being that on the planet. We're going to be very nervous about allowing fires that are appropriate to burn, or taking steps that might reduce overall risk, but are create the potential for liability or loss. A second question is, what's the responsibility of a landowner to maintain land in a responsible way? And here, the landowners typically have to maintain their property to avoid harm to their neighbors, right? So that their neighbors can also enjoy the benefits of land ownership. And a question for California, and it is whether the flammability, the amount of fuels on property should be relevant to thinking about the responsibilities of land ownership. In some places in California, it is. There's interesting variation here, like in certain parts of Southern California, the crime of public nuisance is used used as a tool to force landowners to better maintain their properties, maintain defensible space around their structures, et cetera, by fire departments. But in most parts of California, there's kind of a benign neglect that has worked in the 20th century and has ceased to work well in the 21st, as we see more and larger and more intense wildfire. I'll just note that the liability regime for utilities is special in the sense that utilities are held strictly liable for any ignitions that they cause, and that in large part explains the enormous amount of spending that's occurred in the utility silo on avoiding ignitions, as does, of course, the history. But in general, the pattern we have here is a focus on avoiding ignition, and that lighting a fire is a crime or can constitute negligence, and a general lack of responsibility to landowners for maintaining their land in a way that's going to reduce fire intensity and allow for fire suppression to function well. And that, in lots of ways, goes to explain how we have the spending that we have, where we're very heavily focused on utility ignition and then fire suppression as the focus of spending. Another aspect of the reasons that we spend the money we have has to do with CAL FIRE and the Forest Service and other federal agencies, and funding patterns and institutional structure. CAL FIRE is a firefighting agency. It used to be known as the California Department of Forestry. It used to be a forestry agency. There's still sort of vestiges of that, but largely we have a firefighting agency that's focused on fire suppression with a legal mandate to put all fires out. And that means that we increase that departure from the natural fire ecology in California by the normal functioning of the best funded firefighting agency in the state. U.S. Forest Service is funded in a similar way to CAL FIRE in that they have sort of a fixed budget for firefighting, but then they're also, and I should have said this about CAL FIRE, allowed to dip into emergency funds so they can sort of spend whatever it takes to put all fires out that are potentially damaging to resources. FEMA tends, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, backstops via emergency declaration these costs. So many disaster costs, including the cost of fire suppression, are effectively federalized after federal disaster declarations are declared. In addition, while all of these stakeholders tend to be very focused on fire suppression, there's no agency at the state or federal level whose primary focus is harm or risk reduction, right? Whose focus is on making sure that people and communities are protected from fires that will inevitably occur. Finally, local governments in their zoning and land use role, right, where to build new communities, are largely insulated from all of these costs. They don't pay the cost of putting a community in a place that's going to require an exorbitant amounts of money to defend when a wildfire occurs. So what are the needs? What would we do if we really wanted to change the situation? We wrote a paper last year focused on these issues and trying to frame up what a strategic statewide investment goal should be for wildfire. And I'll just sum it up by saying it needs to be in the billions, not the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. And that needs to be sustained over at least a decade and probably longer. We need sustained investment in that middle column, in that harm reduction column, specifically in home hardening. That's making homes more resistant to ignition, sustained investment in protecting communities, and sustained investment in prescribed fire that will reduce the degree of catastrophic wildfire occurring in the wildlands of California. So home hardening, this is the picture of a wildfire resistant home on the right as compared to a home that's been built to sort of without wildfire in mind, ignited on the left by embers being thrown at both of them in a wind tunnel. There is widespread adoption of wildland urban interface building codes in California that have been shown to be highly effective at reducing ignitions during wildfire, preventing outcomes like Paradise, or allowing homes to survive even within the wildfire footprint. The problem we have is that there's an enormous number of homes that were built prior to the advent of the code. And so we need to figure out a way to harden those homes cost effectively. We also need to be investing in community protection. That is community scale field breaks and wildfire focused planning for communities, so that when fires inevitably approach communities, there's an ability to defend the community as a whole and not just structure by structure. We also need to be thinking about landscape scale field treatment. This is, I think, one of the most compelling pictures I've seen of the impact of thinning and prescribed fire. So removing some fuel from the environment and then applying fire after the fuel treatment to try to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire. This is from the Bootleg fire. And the upper part of the picture, you can see land that has just been torched, where there's nothing left. None of the standing timber survived. In the middle of the frame, you see an area where the Nature Conservancy, in collaboration with native tribes, engaged in systematic thinning of the forest, followed by prescribed fire. And in the bottom, and you can see the benefit that provided as the bootleg fire burned through this area. The flame lengths dropped dramatically. The fire dropped onto the forest floor and burned as a low intensity fire on the forest floor. And much of the standing timber survived. And the forest ecosystem survived intact. In the bottom of the frame, you can see an area that was thinned but not burned. It was scheduled to be burned, but for various reasons that didn't occur prior to the bootleg fire. And you can see that was much less beneficial. There's a lot of ongoing work to study this area and work that was going on before the bootleg fire occurred, actually, to try to systematically evaluate the benefits of different fuel treatments in these types of, this is a east of the Cascades forest. But the bottom line is we need to be investing at the watershed and fireshed scale in these kinds of treatments. And we just aren't doing that on the 50% or so, 46% of lands in California that are in private hands, or the 50% that are in federal hands. So what science do we need? What do we need to be asking as a research community to help motivate, I think, the kinds of policy development that are the gaps right now? One is answering a basic question about the societal costs of wildfire. I led a study conducted by the California Council on Science and Technology to answer this question. And when we got to the end of the study, what we realized is that there wasn't nearly enough information to actually put a price tag on the cost of wildfire in California. If we wanted to include all the costs, and especially the ones that we think are the most significant, especially public health costs. So we need more and better research and on the societal costs of wildfire, not just in terms of acres burned, not just in terms of board feet that never make it to the mill, but in terms of human health impacts and community disruption that are occurring because of wildfire. The second step that we need to take is to map from interventions like the ones that I just identified to the impacts we actually care about. Honestly, I don't care if fuel treatments reduce acres burned. In many ways, fire is fire. If we're engaging in prescribed fire, that's just a different kind of fire. It's lower intensity, has lower emissions. It's much less likely to damage homes or hurt people, but it's fire. And you may as well put it in the acres burned category. What we need to understand is, how do these landscape scale interventions, how does community hardening, and how does home hardening impact measures we actually care about, like structure loss and like public health impacts? And we don't have good measures of that right now. We don't even have good measures, real quantitative measures of the impacts of fuel treatments on fire intensity, which is, like that picture I showed you is a nice anecdote, but it is not a quantification of, the benefit of an east of the Cascades fuel treatment in Oregon. We urgently need that level of quantification. I just said that. And I think that this is, again, work that's ongoing at Stanford. It really plays into Stanford's strengths in terms of our incredible capacity to do high quality science based on machine learning and causal inference using machine learning tools. And there's an urgent need for this in the kind of wildfire policy space. We need to understand better, if we're going to engage in a large-scale home hardening program in California, what matters, right? What are the cost-effective interventions that we can take that are going to reduce structure risk? The wildfire building code for new homes is effective, but it's kind of the kitchen sink, and there's no way that we can do all of the things in that code to existing homes. So what are the interventions we can take on the existing built environment that will reduce risk? Similarly, we need to be thinking about the cost effectiveness of grid hardening. What is the impact of grid hardening on overall risk, on risk of ignitions? And how can we make sure not only that we do, the grid hardening that will reduce the risks we understand today, but think proactively about where the risks will be a decade hence, because grid hardening is a long-term proposition. And overall, I think, if we can take all of those steps, understand the impacts more precisely of the interventions to reduce risk and reduce harm, then we can start to answer questions about cost effectiveness across the different silos of investment. And this is critical. There is a limited amount of money that we're going to spend on this problem. We may already be running up against it at the state level. We're spending on the order of $1.5 billion a year on harm reduction. We need to make sure every dollar goes as far as it can, because the reality is there's just a limited number of dollars that we're ever going to get for this problem, because there are so many other pressing needs in the state and in the West. So I'll stop there with a little bit of time for questions, and I'm happy to try to answer as much as we can.
Well, thank you, Michael. That, as I expected, was very stimulating and I think pretty comprehensive. I'm sure it's hard to be comprehensive of the landscape of wildfires. And I'll open up the floor to questions. Karen has some comments going back and forth to Rebecca there. Karen, would you like to make a comment or ask a question of our speaker?
I just put some comments in the chat. I don't know if I really have any questions, but I think fuel breaks and getting the parks and our open space areas cleaned up is a real challenge. They don't feel that that's their priority. Their priority is, the plants and the animals, which we all do love. I'm not saying that that's not important, but it's been a real challenge to get those folks interested. And my second comment was on Chapter 7A, which really isn't sufficient. We really have to have much stronger building codes than that. That's been shown in Paradise. And here in Portola Valley, we just passed some nice measures, so it can be done.
Great.
I just agree, Karen, especially with your first comment that that we really need to reorient land managers and help them to understand, and also provide them with the resources to conduct adequate fuels management work. It is not just enough to buy land and preserve it anymore. The reality is that we need to be managing the land in a way that is responsible and in a way that really mimics the state of the land pre-European contact, right? That there were other people here who we took the land from that were actively managing it for environmental and ecosystem benefit prior to being removed from it. And you need only look at the fire scars in Big Basin to understand this is the case, right? Low intensity fires were common prior to 1870, occurring every few years in the tree ring records from Big Basin. And then they disappear in 1870. And there's a clear reason why, right? We removed the burners. And it's not as if we're going to allow, we need to develop methodologies for better managing fuel risk or fire risk in California that work today, given that there are 40 million people here. So it's not the 1870s anymore, but that also accomplish the societal goal of avoiding catastrophic fire.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Michael. And I'm going to go through the chats here. People can also raise their hands, but I'm going to go in order here with whatever time we have left. And Laura asked two questions. First, how much do you think we should focus on shingles for home hardening? It seems that they play a huge role in roof-to-roof propagation.
I think so roofs are important. Almost all roofs or new roofs in California are tend to use asphalt shingles, which are pretty fire resistant at this point. But a separate issue where there's a lot more controversy and where the science is pretty clear is what's called zone 0, which is the 5 feet around a structure are incredibly important for ignition. And keeping that 5-foot zone clear of ignitable material does, and that includes vegetation, can do a tremendous amount to improve the survivability of structures. That would be a place where I'd like to see a lot more emphasis. CAL FIRE is working on it, but it's politically a really hard row to hoe.
Thanks, Michael. Bill asked, is there more information regarding what is needed in terms of technologies to improve the home hardening of existing homes?
The place I would point you to is the Institute for Building Home Safety, Bill. They've done a tremendous amount of work to sort of elucidate what works and what doesn't. There's also been some great work published because we've lost so many homes over the last 5 years, and that loss experience creates an opportunity for study. There are a couple of peer-reviewed papers that have come out in the last year or so, focused on Paradise and on the Tubbs fire that burned in Santa Rosa, and just looking at which homes burned, which didn't, and trying to explain those patterns. And the bottom line is, age of structure matters a lot. Whether the structure had to comply with Chapter 7A doesn't fully protect a structure, but it dramatically changes the probability the structure will ignite and burn down. But other also features of which home, what the home next door looks like also really matters. There's kind of a herd immunity phenomenon that's really important as well.
Great. And Laura's second question was, are all ignitions created equal? It does seem that ignition from the grid does it seem that ignitions from the grid create larger, hotter fires than that have the largest impact compared to lightning ignited fires? I guess that's a question or a statement or a hypothesis.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And all ignitions are not created equal. What really matters is when ignitions occur relative to dangerous fire weather. And what's been so harmful about utility ignitions is that they tend to correlate with two things. One is that utility ignitions tend to occur during dangerous fire weather because they're caused by it, right? Strong winds knock loose tree branches that then hit things like power lines and can ignite fire. So you have a fire, an ignition occurring under dangerous conditions. Second is that there are more utility lines where there are houses and people. So you can have, so you increase the probability of a dangerous ignition or multiple ignitions occurring where there are lots of people living. And it's that combination that has led to the really destructive utility with that and poor maintenance of aging infrastructure has led to the problems we've had in California. I think, though, that a number of the fires that have burned over the past several years also indicate that other kinds of ignitions can be incredibly dangerous. And even utility ignitions that occur under relatively benign conditions can lead to catastrophic outcomes because of the fuels environment in which they occur. The Dixie Fire is a great example of that, where it ignited on a not very windy day, wasn't a huge risk where it started, but it turned into a 1 million acre fire that burned down an entire town. And so there's this question about focus, and I guess another point I would make is that the spatial aspect of the problem really matters, right? And the merging of large spatial data sets that can help us understand risk is incredibly important.
That's great. I actually have one question for you. So I really found one of the big messages of yours is we have a certain amount of money, let's spend it efficiently. And yet you raised, I think, an interesting side issue that, half of the money being spent right now is by PG&E and utilities. And yet they have a special liability. In an ideal world, are they spending that $3 billion or whatever I think you had in your bar chart the most effectively, or should we somehow change their liability so that the money they spend is better used in some other area?
Well, a friend of mine says that utility rate making is taxation without representation. And I think there is some truth in that. And the utilities are acting using rates to manage a risk to their customers. They don't, nobody who works for a utility wants to kill people. and also to manage risks for their shareholders, right? That because of the liability regime, they are responsible for all damage that flows from a fire, even if they light a fire and it burns into an explosives factory, and then the explosives factory devastates an area. The utility is fully responsible, and so I think there is a strong bias, and we may be, and I wouldn't say nobody really knows this because this cost effectiveness evaluation just hasn't been done, but it's quite striking to see the magnitude of money that we're throwing at utility hardening. And I think it does raise this question, like, is it worth spending the next $1 billion to reduce utility emissions by a couple of %? Or would it be worth taking that $1 billion and hardening a lot of homes, or say doing systematic fuel treatments around many communities that are at highest risk? And that's a question that's not getting asked today, but I think it needs to be at the state level, because ultimately ratepayers and taxpayers are the same people, right? And it's all coming out of everyone's monthly or annual budget that they are supplying to the government or utilities.
Thank you. That's really, I think, a great way to wrap up. I know there probably are more questions that would like to be asked, but I want to respect our time limits. We are at 1:16. So thank you for everyone who came today. I encourage you to be advocates for our series. I think I'm sure you found Michael's talk stimulating and thought-provoking, and I would encourage you to have other people join us. Next week, we'll be back on Zoom again with Mary Pernicki, who Michael mentioned earlier. So if you want to hear a little bit more about the health impacts related to wildfires, please come to her talk. If you have any questions for Michael, you probably can find him on Stanford Who's, or if not, I can channel questions his way if you have some follow-up questions. But thank you, Michael, again for your time. We'll give you a virtual applause, and I appreciate just your background, being willing to share an hour with us, as well as your insights. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.